With a dismissive wave of his hand, a doctor tells an elderly patient her symptoms are nothing to worry about. Sometime later, he watches in stunned silence as she does something he had never imagined. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Margaret Thompson sat in the sterile waiting room of St. Mary's General Hospital, her weathered hands clutching a worn leather purse. At 78, she had learned to be patient, but the persistent pain in her chest and the shortness of breath that had been plaguing her for weeks demanded attention. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she watched younger patients come and go, some with visible injuries, others looking as concerned as she felt. When her name was finally called, Margaret followed a nurse down a long corridor lined with motivational posters about healthy living. The examination room smelled of disinfectant and had that particular hospital coldness that seemed to seep into your bones. She settled onto the paper-covered examination table, the crinkling sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Dr. Richard Anderson entered without looking up from his tablet, his white coat pristine and his manner brisk. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of confidence that came from years of medical training and countless patients. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his expensive watch caught the light as he finally glanced at Margaret. Mrs. He paused, consulting his tablet. Thompson. Margaret Thompson, she replied softly, her voice carrying the slight tremor that had developed in recent months. Right. What seems to be the problem today, Mrs. Thompson? Dr. Anderson asked, already seeming distracted, as he pulled up her chart on the computer screen. Margaret took a careful breath, trying to organize her thoughts. Doctor, I've been having chest pains for about 3 weeks now. They're sharp, especially when I breathe deeply. And I've been so tired lately, more than usual. Sometimes I feel dizzy when I stand up and— How old are you, Mrs. Thompson? Dr. Anderson interrupted, glancing at her over his tablet. 78. He nodded as if this confirmed something he already suspected. And you live alone? Yes. Since my husband passed 2 years ago. But doctor, about these symptoms— Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Anderson said, setting down his tablet and crossing his arms, what you're describing is very common for someone your age. As we get older, our bodies naturally slow down. You're probably just feeling the effects of aging. Maybe you've been more active lately, doing spring cleaning? Margaret felt a flutter of frustration. Doctor, I know my body. This isn't just being tired. The chest pain is sharp, and it comes suddenly. Sometimes I can barely catch my breath. Dr. Anderson picked up his stethoscope, more out of routine than genuine concern. He listened to her heart and lungs for perhaps 30 seconds, his expression unchanged. Everything sounds normal. Your heart rate is a bit elevated, but that's likely due to anxiety about being here. But the pain, Mrs. Thompson, I see dozens of patients every week with similar complaints. What you're experiencing is very typical for your age group. My advice would be to get more rest. Maybe take some over-the-counter pain medication if you're uncomfortable. Have you been eating well? Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and frustration. Doctor, I raised 5 children and ran a household for 50 years. I think I know how to take care of myself. This is different. Dr. Anderson's smile was patronizing, the kind reserved for difficult elderly patients. Of course you do. But sometimes we need to accept that our bodies aren't what they used to be. I'm going to recommend you follow up with your primary care physician in a few weeks if you're still concerned. In the meantime, try to stay active, but don't overdo it. Shouldn't we run some tests? Maybe an EKG or blood work? Margaret asked, her voice growing smaller as she sensed the doctor's impatience. Mrs. Thompson, we can't run expensive tests for every ache and pain. Your symptoms are consistent with normal aging. Running unnecessary tests would be a waste of hospital resources. He was already moving toward the door, tablet in hand. Margaret sat in stunned silence for a moment. In all her years, She had never been dismissed so cavalierly by a medical professional. Her own family doctor had retired the previous year, and she had been hoping to establish care with someone new, someone who would listen. "So there's nothing you can do?" she asked quietly. "Get some rest, Mrs. Thompson, and maybe consider that. Sometimes the best medicine is accepting our limitations." With that, Dr. Anderson left the room, leaving Margaret sitting alone on the examination table. The nurse who came to escort her out was kinder, offering Margaret a gentle smile and asking if she needed help to her car. But the damage was done. Margaret felt smaller somehow, diminished by the interaction. As she made her way through the hospital corridors, she noticed the plaques on the walls thanking various donors, the gleaming equipment, the bustling efficiency of the place. Outside in the parking lot, Margaret sat in her modest sedan for several minutes before starting the engine. The chest pain was still there, sharp and insistent. The fatigue seemed to weigh her down even more heavily now. But mixed with these physical symptoms was something else entirely, a deep sense of indignation that surprised her with its intensity. As she drove home to her small house on Maple Street, Margaret found herself thinking not just about Dr. Anderson's dismissive attitude, but about all the elderly patients who might have received similar treatment. How many people like her were sent away with their concerns unheard, their symptoms attributed to nothing more than the inconvenience of aging. The pain in her chest seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, a reminder that something was definitely wrong, regardless of what the young doctor believed. The sleepless nights that followed Margaret's hospital visit only confirmed her suspicions that something was seriously amiss. The chest pain had intensified, and she found herself unable to climb the stairs to her bedroom without stopping to rest. Her neighbor, Susan Davis, had noticed Margaret's drawn appearance when she brought in the mail. "Margaret?" "Honey, you look terrible," Susan said bluntly, her concern overriding politeness. Susan was 65 herself, a retired teacher with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Have you seen a doctor about this?" Margaret found herself recounting the dismissive encounter with Dr. Anderson, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Susan listened with growing indignation, shaking her head at intervals. "That's absolutely unacceptable," Susan declared. "My daughter Jennifer works at the medical center downtown. She's always talking about how important it is to advocate for yourself, especially as we get older. You need to see someone else, someone who will actually listen." That afternoon, Susan drove Margaret to the downtown medical center, where Dr. Patricia Miller practiced internal medicine. The waiting room was smaller, more intimate than the hospital, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. When Dr. Miller entered the examination room, the contrast with Dr. Anderson was immediately apparent. Dr. Miller was perhaps 50, with graying blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She sat down across from Margaret, rather than remaining standing, and made eye contact as she spoke. "Mrs. Thompson, I've reviewed the notes from your recent hospital visit. I'd like to hear about your symptoms in your own words, without any preconceptions." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt truly heard. She described the chest pain, the fatigue, the dizziness, and the growing shortness of breath. Dr. Miller asked detailed questions, took careful notes, and performed a thorough examination. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm concerned about what you're describing. These symptoms warrant investigation. I'd like to order an EKG, some blood work, and a chest X-ray. Can we get those done today?" Margaret felt a mixture of relief and vindication. "Dr. Anderson at the hospital said these were just normal signs of aging." Dr. Miller's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, chest pain and shortness of breath are never just aging. They're symptoms that need to be evaluated properly, regardless of a patient's age." The tests were conducted efficiently, and Dr. Miller asked Margaret to return the following day for the results. As Margaret left the medical center, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. The next morning brought devastating news. Dr. Miller's expression was grave, as she sat across from Margaret in her office. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm afraid, the tests show some serious concerns. Your EKG indicates you've had a heart attack, likely within the past few weeks. The blood work shows elevated cardiac enzymes, which confirms this. Additionally, the chest X-ray reveals some fluid in your lungs, which explains your shortness of breath." Margaret felt the room spin slightly. "A heart attack? But I thought heart attacks were supposed to be dramatic, with crushing pain, and women, especially older women, often experience heart attacks differently than the classic symptoms we see in movies. What you've been experiencing, the chest pain, fatigue, shortness of breath, these are all classic signs that were missed." Dr. Miller leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Thompson, if this had been caught earlier, we could have prevented further damage to your heart. The delay in proper diagnosis has complicated your situation significantly." Margaret sat in stunned silence, processing the information. Finally, she asked quietly, "What happens now?" "We need to get you to a cardiologist immediately. You're going to need medication to manage the heart damage and possibly some interventional procedures. The good news is that you're here now, and we're going to take excellent care of you." As Dr. Miller made arrangements for Margaret's immediate transfer to a cardiac specialist, Margaret found herself thinking about Dr. Anderson's dismissive attitude. How different things might have been if he had simply listened, if he had ordered the basic tests that Dr. Miller had performed. The cardiologist, Dr. James Wilson, confirmed Dr. Miller's findings and immediately started Margaret on medications to protect her heart and prevent further damage. He was kind but direct about her prognosis. "Mrs. Thompson, you've suffered what we call a silent heart attack. Without proper treatment immediately afterward, some permanent damage has occurred. However, with the right medications and lifestyle modifications, you can still live a full life." Over the following days, as Margaret underwent treatment and began her recovery, she had plenty of time to think. The cardiac ward was filled with other patients, many of whom shared stories of dismissive doctors, delayed diagnoses, and the particular challenges that elderly patients faced in getting proper medical care. Margaret's roommate, Betty Johnson, was 74 and recovering from bypass surgery that could have been avoided if her symptoms had been taken seriously months earlier. "They treat us like we're invisible," Betty said one evening as they watched the sunset through the hospital window. "Like our health doesn't matter because we're old." Margaret nodded, feeling a growing sense of purpose alongside her physical recovery. The medications were helping and her strength was slowly returning, but something else was growing stronger. Too, a determination that other patients shouldn't have to endure what she had experienced. During her week-long stay in the cardiac unit, Margaret observed everything: the dedicated nurses who worked tirelessly, the outdated equipment, the overcrowded conditions, and the stories of other elderly patients who had been dismissed or ignored until their conditions became critical. As her discharge day approached, Margaret knew that her encounter with Dr. Anderson and the subsequent proper care she had received had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Once Margaret was discharged from the hospital, her recovery at home gave her ample time to reflect on her experience. The medications Dr. Wilson had prescribed were helping, and she was gradually regaining her strength. But her mind was sharp and focused on something that had been bothering her since her stay in the cardiac ward. She began to research heart attacks in elderly women, spending hours at her computer, learning about symptoms, treatment protocols, and outcome statistics. What she discovered was both enlightening and infuriating. The dismissive treatment she had received from Dr. Anderson wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of medical bias against elderly patients, particularly women. Susan Davis had been visiting daily, helping with groceries and household tasks during Margaret's recovery. One afternoon, as they sat in Margaret's living room with tea, Susan brought up something that had been weighing on her mind. "Margaret, I've been thinking about what happened to you, and I wonder if there are other patients who've had similar experiences with Dr. Anderson. My friend Carol mentioned that her mother had a terrible experience at St. Mary's last year." This conversation sparked an idea in Margaret's mind. Over the following weeks, with Susan's help, she began reaching out to other elderly residents in their neighborhood and the surrounding community. What they discovered was troubling. Mrs. Eleanor White, 82, had been dismissed by Dr. Anderson when she complained of severe abdominal pain. She was told it was probably just gas and sent home with antacids. 3 days later, she was rushed to the emergency room with a perforated ulcer that required emergency surgery. Mr. Robert Davis, 76, had seen Dr. Anderson about persistent headaches and vision problems. He was told it was normal age-related changes and advised to get to reading glasses. A week later, another doctor discovered he had dangerously high blood pressure that had gone undiagnosed and untreated. Mrs. Janet Brown, 79, had complained of constant fatigue and weight loss. Dr. Anderson attributed it to depression and aging, suggesting she stay busy and think positive thoughts. Another physician later diagnosed her with thyroid disease that had been progressing for months. As Margaret compiled these stories, a clear pattern emerged. Dr. Anderson consistently dismissed elderly patients' concerns, attributing serious symptoms to normal aging without proper investigation. The pattern was so consistent that Margaret began to wonder if it was deliberate negligence or simply profound incompetence. Margaret decided to take her concerns to the hospital administration. She requested a meeting with Dr. Thomas Clark, the Chief of Staff at St. Mary's General Hospital. Dr. Clark was a distinguished man in his 60s with gray hair and a kind demeanor that immediately put Margaret at ease. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand you have some concerns about the care you received here," Dr. Clark said, gesturing for her to sit in one of the comfortable chairs in his office. Margaret had prepared carefully for this meeting. She presented her case methodically, starting with her own experience and then sharing the documented stories of other elderly patients who had been dismissed by Dr. Anderson. She had compiled medical records, documentation of delayed diagnoses, and statements from the patients and their families. Dr. Clark listened intently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. His expression grew increasingly serious as Margaret presented each case. "Mrs. Thompson, these are very serious allegations. If what you're telling me is accurate, this represents a significant pattern of substandard care. Dr. Clark, I'm not looking to destroy anyone's career, but I am concerned about other elderly patients who might be receiving similar treatment. We deserve the same level of care and attention as younger patients." Dr. Clark nodded gravely. "You're absolutely right. Every patient deserves proper medical attention regardless of age. I want you to know that I'm going to launch a formal investigation into these cases immediately." Over the following month, the hospital conducted a thorough review of Dr. Anderson's patient files, focusing particularly on his treatment of elderly patients. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern that went back several years. Medical consultants brought in from outside the hospital confirmed that numerous patients had received substandard care, with symptoms being inappropriately dismissed without proper testing or follow-up. Dr. Clark called Margaret personally to update her on the investigation's findings. "Mrs. Thompson, I want to thank you for bringing this to our attention. The investigation has revealed serious deficiencies in patient care that we cannot and will not tolerate. Dr. Anderson will be subject to disciplinary action, and we're implementing new protocols to ensure this doesn't happen again." But Margaret wasn't finished. Her research had revealed something else that troubled her deeply. The hospital's financial struggles were affecting patient care in ways that went beyond one negligent. Dr. St. Mary's General Hospital was operating on a tight budget. Equipment was outdated, staffing levels were below optimal, and there was pressure on doctors to see more patients in less time. Margaret began to understand that Dr. Anderson's behavior, while inexcusable, might have been exacerbated by systemic issues within the hospital itself. During one of her follow-up appointments with Dr. Wilson, she asked him about the hospital's situation. "Mrs. Thompson, I'll be honest with you, we're struggling financially. We serve a lot of elderly and low-income patients, and reimbursement rates don't always cover our costs. We make do with what we have, but it's not always easy." That evening, Margaret sat in her small living room, surrounded by the research she had compiled over the past months. The investigation into Dr. Anderson was proceeding, and changes were being implemented at the hospital. But she realized that addressing one doctor's negligence wasn't enough if the underlying systemic problems remained unresolved. As she looked around her modest home, Margaret's mind began forming the outline of an idea that would surprise everyone who knew her, an idea that would address not just the symptoms of the problem, but the root causes that had led to her dismissive treatment and the substandard care received by so many other elderly patients. The idea was audacious, perhaps even impossible, but as Margaret considered it more deeply, she realized it might be the only way to ensure that no other elderly patient would have to endure what she had experienced. Margaret Thompson had never been one to flaunt wealth or draw attention to herself. After her husband William's death 2 years earlier, she had maintained the same modest lifestyle they had shared for decades. Their small house on Maple Street was comfortable but unremarkable, filled with furniture they had accumulated over 53 years of marriage. To her neighbors and acquaintances, she appeared to be a typical elderly widow living on a fixed income. What no one knew, not even her closest friend Susan, was that Margaret was harboring a secret that would have shocked anyone who knew her. The secret lay in a safety deposit box at First National Bank, where Margaret made a monthly visit that she had never explained to anyone. On a crisp October morning, 3 months after her heart attack, she made her way to the bank with a sense of purpose that had been building since her investigation into Dr. Anderson and the hospital's problems. Mr. Charles Peterson, the bank manager, greeted her warmly, as he always did. He was one of the few people who knew the truth about Margaret's financial situation, having handled her affairs since William's death. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. How are you feeling? I heard you'd been in the hospital." "Much better, thank you, Charles. I need to access my safety deposit box today, and I think it's time we had a serious conversation about my assets." In the privacy of the bank's vault room, Margaret opened the metal box that contained the documentation of a fortune that would have amazed anyone who knew her. Stock certificates, bond documents, property deeds, and investment statements filled the box, the accumulated wealth of a lifetime of careful saving and, more significantly, an inheritance that had transformed her from a middle-class retiree into a multimillionaire. The story of Margaret's wealth began with her husband's uncle, Robert Thompson, a man she had met only a handful of times during her marriage. Uncle Robert had been something of a family mystery, a reclusive bachelor who had made a fortune in early computer technology investments in the 1970s and 80s. He had lived simply, much like Margaret and William, never marrying and maintaining minimal contact with family. When Uncle Robert died 5 years earlier at the age of 91, his will had shocked everyone. He had left his entire estate, worth over $12 million, to William, citing his respect for William's integrity and the stable marriage he and Margaret had maintained. The inheritance included stock portfolios, real estate investments, and cash holdings that had continued to grow under the careful management of the bank's investment division. William had been overwhelmed by the inheritance, and he and Margaret had made a pact to continue living simply while deciding how best to use their unexpected fortune. They had planned to establish charitable foundations and make meaningful contributions to causes they cared about. But William's sudden death from a stroke had left Margaret alone with the responsibility and the secret. "Charles," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I think it's time to put this money to work in a way that William would have approved of." She explained her experience at St. Mary's Hospital, the investigation into Dr. Anderson, and her growing understanding of the systemic problems facing healthcare for elderly patients. As she spoke, Mr. Peterson listened with growing interest and admiration. "Mrs. Thompson, what you went through sounds terrible, but what you're considering is remarkable. Have you thought about the scope of what you're proposing?" Margaret pulled out a folder she had prepared filled with research on hospital funding, medical equipment costs, and staffing needs. Her investigation into her own care had evolved into a comprehensive study of healthcare delivery for elderly patients. "I've been thinking about this for months, Charles. St. Mary's Hospital serves thousands of elderly patients every year. They're understaffed, under-equipped, and operating under financial pressure that contributes to the kind of negligent care I received. I want to change that." She outlined her preliminary plan, a major donation to St. Mary's Hospital that would fund improvements in geriatric care, new medical equipment, additional staffing, and training programs focused on elderly patient needs. But more than just writing a check, Margaret wanted to ensure that her donation would create lasting change. "I want to establish conditions for the donation," she explained. "Accountability measures, ongoing training requirements, and patient advocacy programs. I want to make sure that no elderly patient ever receives the dismissive treatment I got from Dr. Anderson." Mr. Peterson was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what Margaret was proposing. "Mrs. Thompson, a donation of this size, we're talking about several $1,000,000, would certainly get the hospital's attention. But are you sure you want to give so much to the same institution that failed you so badly?" Margaret had anticipated this question. "Charles, I could donate to other hospitals, other causes. But St. Mary's is where the problem exists, and it's where I want to fix it. Besides, despite Dr. Anderson's negligence, there are wonderful people working there. Nurses, doctors like Dr. Wilson who saved my life, staff members who truly care about patients. They deserve better resources to do their jobs properly." Over the following weeks, Margaret worked with Mr. Peterson and the bank's legal team to structure her donation. She consulted with healthcare experts, hospital administrators from other institutions, and patient advocacy groups to develop a comprehensive plan that would address not just equipment and staffing needs, but also cultural changes in how elderly patients were treated. The donation would total $8 million, two-thirds of her inheritance, structured as an endowment that would provide ongoing funding for geriatric care improvements at St. Mary's. The conditions were specific and non-negotiable: mandatory training for all medical staff on geriatric care, updated diagnostic equipment, additional nursing staff for elderly patients, and the establishment of a patient advocacy program specifically for seniors. Additionally, Margaret insisted on creating the William Thompson Center for Geriatric Excellence within the hospital, named in honor of her late husband. The center would serve as a model for elderly patient care, with specialized staff, comfortable accommodations, and protocols designed specifically for the unique needs of older adults. As news of Margaret's planned donation began to spread through the bank and legal community, people who had known her for years struggled to reconcile the modest widow they knew with the philanthropist she was about to become. Susan Davis was the first person Margaret told about her decision, though she didn't reveal the full extent of her wealth. "Margaret, this is wonderful. But can you afford such a generous donation?" Susan asked, concerned about her friend's financial security. Margaret smiled mysteriously. "Susan, William, and I were more fortunate than we ever let on. This donation will ensure that other elderly patients receive the care and respect they deserve. It's what William would have wanted." As Margaret finalized the details of her donation, she felt a sense of purpose and peace that she hadn't experienced since William's death. The money that had sat unused in investment accounts would finally serve a meaningful purpose, transforming the very hospital that had initially failed her into a model of excellent geriatric care. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to become the most significant benefactor in St. Mary's Hospital's history, funding improvements that would benefit thousands of elderly patients, while also ensuring that doctors like Anderson would never again be able to dismiss elderly patients. Concerns without consequence. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early November. Dr. Thomas Clark's voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could detect an undercurrent of excitement and disbelief. "Mrs. Thompson, could you possibly come in for a meeting this afternoon? There's something quite important I need to discuss with you regarding your concerns about elderly patient care at our facility." Margaret smiled to herself as she agreed to the meeting. She had been expecting this call ever since her attorney had contacted the hospital the previous week to outline the terms of her potential donation. She could only imagine the flurry of activity her proposal had generated among the hospital's administration. She dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a simple navy dress and her best jewelry, pieces she rarely wore but that had belonged to William's mother. Today felt like an occasion that called for a touch of elegance. When Margaret arrived at St. Mary's Hospital, she was greeted not just by Dr. Clark, but by a small committee that included the hospital's chief financial officer, the director of nursing, and 2 members of the board of directors. They gathered in the hospital's executive conference room, a space Margaret had never seen before, with its polished table and panoramic view of the city. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Clark began, his voice carrying a tone of barely contained amazement, "we've received a rather extraordinary proposal from your legal representatives. I have to say, when I first read it, I thought there might have been some sort of mistake." Margaret settled into her chair with the quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout her life. "No mistake, Dr. Clark. I'm quite serious about my proposal." The chief financial officer, a woman named Linda Martinez, leaned forward with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Thompson, if you don't mind me asking, the proposed donation amount is substantial. Are you certain about the financial commitment you're considering?" $8 million, Margaret said simply. "Yes, I'm quite certain." The room fell into stunned silence. Even though they had read the proposal, hearing the amount spoken aloud by this modest elderly woman seemed to make it more real and more shocking. Dr. Clark cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson, I have to admit, when you first came to me with concerns about Dr. Anderson's treatment of elderly patients, I never imagined, this level of generosity is unprecedented in our hospital's history." Margaret's expression grew more serious. "Dr. Clark, this isn't about generosity. This is about ensuring that elderly patients receive the quality of care they deserve. My experience with Dr. Anderson was unacceptable, but more importantly, it revealed systemic problems that affect hundreds of patients." She pulled out her own folder filled with the research and documentation she had compiled over the past months. "I've spent considerable time investigating not just individual cases of poor care, but the underlying issues that contribute to these problems: staffing shortages, outdated equipment, lack of specialized training in geriatric medicine. These are the root causes that need to be addressed." The director of nursing, Robert Johnson, spoke up. "Mrs. Thompson, your proposal mentions specific requirements for staffing ratios and specialized training. Have you worked in healthcare? Your understanding of our needs is remarkably comprehensive." Margaret smiled slightly. "Mr. Johnson, I've been a patient and an advocate for other patients. I've also had the time and resources to educate myself thoroughly about these issues. When you're dismissed by a doctor and nearly die as a result, it tends to focus your attention on systemic problems." Linda Martinez was reviewing the proposal documents. "Mrs. Thompson, the endowment structure you're proposing is quite sophisticated. This would provide sustainable funding for improvements over decades, not just a one-time gift." Exactly, Margaret replied. I'm not interested in having a wing named after me or a plaque on a wall. I want to create lasting change that will benefit elderly patients long after I'm gone. Dr. Clark leaned back in his chair, still processing the magnitude of what was being offered. Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, and please forgive the directness, but given your experience here, why are you choosing to donate to St. Mary's rather than another institution? Margaret had been expecting this question. Dr. Clark, despite what happened with Dr. Anderson, this hospital serves thousands of elderly patients in our community. The nurses who cared for me in the cardiac unit were extraordinary. Dr. Wilson saved my life with his expertise and compassion. Rather than abandon St. Mary's, I want to help it become the kind of institution that consistently provides excellent care to elderly patients. She paused, her voice growing stronger. Besides, change is most meaningful when it happens where the problems exist. I could donate to a hospital that already provides excellent geriatric care, but that wouldn't help. The elderly patients who come here, one of the board members, an elderly man named Frank Williams, spoke for the first time. Mrs. Thompson, what you're proposing would transform our ability to care for elderly patients. The William Thompson Center for Geriatric Excellence alone would be a game changer for our community. Margaret's eyes softened at the mention of the center, named for her late husband. My husband, William, was a good man who believed in helping others. He would have supported this donation wholeheartedly. The center will be his legacy as much as mine. Dr. Clark gathered the documents in front of him. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that your proposal has our full support. The conditions you've outlined, the training requirements, the staffing improvements, the patient advocacy programs, these align perfectly with our goals for improving patient care. What about Dr. Anderson? Margaret asked quietly. Doctor. Clark's expression became serious. Based on our investigation, Dr. Anderson is no longer with our hospital. His pattern of dismissive treatment toward elderly patients was unacceptable, and we've taken appropriate action. Margaret nodded, feeling a sense of closure on that aspect of her ordeal. I'm glad to hear that. But the real victory won't be one doctor losing his job. It will be a systemic change that prevents this from happening to other patients. As the meeting continued, they discussed implementation timelines, oversight committees, and the specific programs that would be funded by Margaret's donation. The transformation she was proposing would take several years to fully implement, but the impact would be immediate and lasting. When the meeting concluded, Margaret felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The modest widow, who had been dismissed and nearly died due to medical negligence, was about to become the driving force behind one of the most significant improvements in elderly patient care in the region's history. As she left the hospital that day, Margaret noticed the busy emergency department, the dedicated staff, and the elderly patients waiting for care. Soon, those patients would benefit from the changes her donation would fund: better equipment, more staff, specialized training, and a culture that valued and respected elderly patients' concerns. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She was about to fund the very hospital that had failed her so dramatically, transforming it into a model of excellent geriatric care that would serve as her husband's legacy and her own contribution to ensuring that no elderly patient would ever again be dismissed the way she had been. The press conference was scheduled for a crisp December morning in the hospital's main lobby. Margaret had initially resisted the idea of public attention, preferring to make her donation quietly, but Dr. Clark and the hospital's board had convinced her that publicity would amplify the impact of her gift and draw attention to the important issues affecting elderly patient care. News of the unprecedented donation had begun to leak through the medical community over the past week, generating considerable buzz among healthcare professionals and local media. The story of a modest elderly widow making an $8 million donation to the same hospital that had initially dismissed her medical concerns was the kind of human interest story that captured public imagination. Margaret stood in front of her bedroom mirror that morning, adjusting the pearl necklace William had given her for their 25th wedding anniversary. She had chosen an elegant burgundy dress that she had worn only once before, to William's funeral. Today felt appropriate for bringing it out again, as she was about to honor his memory in a very public way. Susan Davis had insisted on driving her to the hospital, still somewhat stunned by the revelation of her friend's hidden wealth and extraordinary generosity. "Margaret, I still can't believe this is really happening," Susan said, as they pulled into the hospital parking lot, which was busier than usual due to the media presence. $8 million. I mean, I knew you and William were comfortable, but this—" Margaret smiled at her friend's amazement. "Susan, William and I were blessed with more than we needed. This feels like the right way to use that blessing." The hospital's main lobby had been transformed for the occasion. A small stage had been set up with a podium, and rows of chairs faced the area where Margaret would make her announcement. Locally, television crews were setting up cameras, and newspaper reporters were interviewing hospital staff and early arrivals. Dr. Clark greeted Margaret warmly as she entered the hospital. "Mrs. Thompson, are you ready for this? I know public speaking wasn't something you were enthusiastic about." "I'm ready, Dr. Clark." This story needs to be told, not just about the donation, but about the importance of listening to elderly patients and providing them with quality care. The audience that gathered was diverse and impressive. Hospital staff filled many of the chairs, from nurses and orderlies to department heads and administrators. Community leaders were present, including the mayor, several city council members, and representatives from other healthcare facilities. Medical professionals from throughout the region had come to witness what was being described as one of the most significant healthcare donations in the area's history. Also present were some of the elderly patients whose stories Margaret had documented during her investigation: Mrs. Eleanor White, Mr. Robert Davis, and Mrs. Janet Brown, among others. These were the people whose experiences had motivated Margaret to take action, and she had specifically requested their presence. As Margaret took the podium, the room fell silent. She looked out at the audience, taking a moment to gather her thoughts and calm her nerves. Public speaking had never been her strength, but the importance of her message gave her courage. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. 6 months ago, I came to this hospital experiencing chest pain, shortness of breath, and fatigue. I was 78 years old, recently widowed, and concerned about my health. What happened next changed my life and led to the announcement I'm making today. Margaret recounted her experience with Dr. Anderson, speaking clearly about the dismissive treatment she had received and the near-fatal consequences of his negligence. She could see the discomfort on some faces in the audience, but she continued with quiet determination. "I was fortunate that Dr. Patricia Miller and Dr. James Wilson provided me with the excellent care I needed, probably saving my life. But my experience made me realize that dismissive treatment of elderly patients isn't an isolated problem. It's a systemic issue that affects healthcare delivery throughout our community." She spoke about her investigation into other cases of elderly patients receiving substandard care, the stories of neighbors and community members who had been dismissed or inadequately treated because of their age. "What I discovered was deeply troubling but not surprising to anyone who works in healthcare or anyone who has advocated for elderly family members. Too often the legitimate medical concerns of older adults are attributed to normal aging without proper investigation or testing." Margaret paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Today, I'm announcing a donation of $8 million to St. Mary's General Hospital, specifically designated for improvements in geriatric patient care. This donation will establish the William Thompson Center for Geriatric Excellence, named in honor of my late husband, a man who believed deeply in treating all people with dignity and respect." The room erupted in surprised murmurs and spontaneous applause. Even though rumors of a significant donation had circulated, the actual amount exceeded most people's expectations. Margaret waited for the room to quiet before outlining the specific programs the donation would fund: updated diagnostic equipment, additional nursing staff trained in geriatric care, mandatory education programs for all medical personnel on elderly patient needs, and the establishment of a patient advocacy program specifically for seniors. "This donation comes with conditions," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not interested in simply writing a check and walking away. I want accountability, transparency, and measurable improvements in how elderly patients are treated at this institution." Dr. Clark stepped forward to accept a symbolic, oversized check and to address the audience about the hospital's commitment to the programs Margaret was funding. He spoke about the investigation into Dr. Anderson's care and the systemic changes already being implemented. "Mrs. Thompson's generosity will allow us to transform our approach to geriatric care," Dr. Clark announced. "But more than that, her courage in speaking out about substandard care has already led to important changes in our protocols and attitudes." After the formal presentations, Margaret was surrounded by reporters asking questions about her motivation, her background, and her plans for ensuring the donation's effectiveness. She answered each question thoughtfully, always returning the focus to the broader issues of elderly patient care rather than her personal story. One reporter asked the question that many in attendance were wondering about: "Mrs. Thompson, can you tell us how a retired widow was able to make such a substantial donation?" Margaret had prepared for this question. "My husband and I were blessed with an unexpected inheritance several years ago. We lived modestly and saved carefully throughout our lives, but this inheritance gave us resources we had never imagined. My husband and I had planned to use this money for charitable purposes, and I believe this donation honors his memory and his values." Dr. Patricia Miller, who had provided Margaret with the proper diagnosis and care, was present for the announcement. When asked for comment, she spoke passionately about the importance of listening to all patients, regardless of age. "Mrs. Thompson's experience highlights a serious problem in healthcare," Dr. Miller said. "Age bias in medical care is real and dangerous. This donation will help ensure that elderly patients receive the thorough, respectful care they deserve." The most moving moment of the press conference came when Mrs. Eleanor White, one of the elderly patients whose story Margaret had documented, stood to address the audience. "I want to thank Margaret Thompson for listening to us and for taking action," Mrs. White said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Too many of us have been made to feel like we're being dramatic or demanding when we seek medical care. This donation gives me hope that my grandchildren will receive better treatment when they're our age." Local news coverage of the donation was extensive, with evening broadcasts leading with the story of the unlikely benefactor, who had transformed a dismissive medical encounter into one of the largest health care donations in the region's history. National health publications picked up the story, framing it as an example of how patient advocacy could drive systemic change in health care delivery. The mayor praised Margaret during the press conference, announcing that the city would recognize her contributions with a Community Service Award. Several other healthcare facilities reached out to inquire about implementing similar programs for elderly patient care. As the press conference concluded, Margaret was approached by numerous hospital staff members who wanted to thank her personally. Nurses, orderlies, and younger doctors expressed their gratitude for resources that would help them provide better care to elderly patients. One young resident, Dr. Sarah Johnson, approached Margaret with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, I've seen too many elderly patients dismissed or rushed through appointments. Your donation will give us the time and resources to provide the kind of care we went to medical school to provide." Margaret was deeply moved by these personal interactions. While the financial aspect of her donation was significant, Seeing the immediate impact on staff morale and commitment reminded her that lasting change required both resources and cultural transformation. As Susan drove her home that afternoon, Margaret reflected on the morning's events. The shy, modest widow, who had been dismissed by Dr. Anderson 6 months earlier, had become a public figure and a catalyst for change in healthcare delivery. "How do you feel?" Susan asked as they pulled into Margaret's driveway. Margaret considered the question carefully. "Hopeful," she said finally. "For the first time since William died, I feel like I'm doing something that will make a real difference in people's lives." That evening, Margaret sat in her living room watching the news coverage of her donation. The story had captured public attention not just because of the dollar amount, but because it represented hope that individual actions could address systemic problems in healthcare. Phone calls poured in from friends, relatives, and even strangers who had heard the story and wanted to express their admiration and gratitude. Margaret was gracious but humble in her responses, always redirecting attention to the broader issues of elderly patient care rather than her personal generosity. The announcement had exceeded everyone's expectations, generating not just media coverage, but genuine excitement about the possibility of transforming elderly patient care at St. Mary's and potentially serving as a model for other healthcare institutions. The months following Margaret's announcement were a whirlwind of activity at St. Mary's General Hospital. The $8 million donation had generated not only media attention, but also a sense of purpose and excitement among the hospital staff that Dr. Clark had never witnessed in his 20 years as chief of staff. Margaret had insisted on being actively involved in the implementation process, despite the hospital administration's initial suggestion that she could simply provide oversight from a distance. She attended weekly planning meetings, reviewed architectural plans for the new William Thompson Center for Geriatric Excellence, and interviewed candidates for key positions in the expanded elderly care program. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Clark said, during one of their regular meetings, "I have to admit, when you first proposed this donation, I underestimated your commitment to hands-on involvement. Most major donors prefer to remain more detached from the day-to-day implementation." Margaret smiled, reviewing the latest budget reports spread across the conference table. "Dr. Clark, this isn't just about money. This is about ensuring that the changes we implement actually improve patient care. I've learned that good intentions without proper oversight don't always translate into meaningful results." The first major hire funded by Margaret's donation was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a geriatrician with 15 years of experience in elderly patient care and a reputation for innovative approaches to age-related medical issues. Dr. Walsh had been recruited from a prestigious medical center in Boston, drawn by the opportunity to build a comprehensive geriatric program from the ground up. During her interview process, Dr. Walsh had been impressed not only by the scope of the funding, but by Margaret's direct involvement in the planning process. "Mrs. Thompson, I've worked with many hospital benefactors over the years, but I've never encountered someone who understands the specific challenges of elderly patient care as thoroughly as you do," Dr. Walsh said during their first meeting. "Your research and documentation of systemic problems shows a level of insight that many healthcare administrators never develop." Margaret appreciated Dr. Walsh's expertise and collaborative approach. "Dr. Walsh, I became an expert in these issues because I had to. My life depended on it. I want to make sure that other elderly patients don't have to become advocates for their own basic medical care." The architectural plans for the William Thompson Center were developed with input from geriatric specialists, occupational therapists, and elderly patients themselves. Margaret had insisted that the center be designed specifically for the needs of older adults, with wider corridors for wheelchairs and walkers, better lighting to accommodate aging vision, comfortable seating areas for families, and examination rooms equipped with the latest diagnostic equipment. Construction began in early spring, with Margaret attending the groundbreaking ceremony alongside local officials and hospital staff. As she turned the first shovel of dirt for the center named in her husband's honor, Margaret felt William's presence and approval. The staffing improvements funded by the donation were equally comprehensive. Additional nurses were hired specifically for elderly patient care, with all nursing staff receiving mandatory training in geriatric medicine. The nurse-to-patient ratios in areas serving elderly patients were improved significantly, allowing for more individualized attention and thorough assessment of patient concerns. Robert Johnson, the director of nursing, had initially been skeptical about the extensive training requirements Margaret had mandated, but he quickly became one of the program's strongest advocates. "The training has transformed how our staff approaches elderly patient care," he reported during a quarterly review meeting. "Our nurses are more confident in assessing geriatric-specific symptoms, and they're taking more time to listen to patient concerns. The improvement in patient satisfaction scores has been remarkable." Margaret had also insisted on implementing a patient advocacy program specifically for elderly patients. This program provided trained advocates who could accompany seniors to medical appointments, help them communicate with healthcare providers, and ensure their concerns were properly addressed. The first patient advocate hired was Maria Rodriguez, a former social worker with extensive experience in geriatric care. Maria's position was funded directly by Margaret's donation, and she reported regularly to Margaret about the program's effectiveness. "Mrs. Thompson, in just the first 3 months I've assisted 47 elderly patients with medical appointments and hospital stays," Maria reported. "The impact has been immediate and significant. Patients feel more confident, doctors are more thorough in their assessments, and we're catching medical issues earlier." One of the most challenging aspects of implementation was establishing the mandatory education program for all medical staff. Margaret had insisted that every doctor, nurse, and medical assistant receive training in elderly patient care, age-related medical issues, and communication techniques specific to geriatric medicine. Some physicians initially resisted the training requirements, viewing them as unnecessary or condescending. Dr. Michael Roberts, a young emergency medicine physician, was among the early skeptics. "I went to medical school," Dr. Roberts complained during one of the training sessions. "I know how to treat patients regardless of their age." Margaret, who attended several of the training sessions as an observer, asked to address Dr. Roberts's concerns directly. "Dr. Roberts, I'm sure you're an excellent physician with the best intentions toward all your patients," Margaret said calmly. "But good intentions aren't always enough. I received care from a doctor who I'm sure believed he was treating me appropriately, but his assumptions about aging nearly cost me my life." She shared her story with the group, describing how her heart attack symptoms had been dismissed as normal aging, and the near-fatal consequences of that dismissal. "The training isn't questioning your competence," Margaret continued. "It's providing you with specific tools and knowledge to better serve elderly patients who may present symptoms differently or have communication styles that require different approaches." Dr. Roberts was visibly moved by Margaret's story, and he became one of the program's strongest supporters among the younger physicians. The technological improvements funded by the donation were equally impressive. New diagnostic equipment specifically chosen for its effectiveness with elderly patients was installed throughout the hospital. EKG machines with enhanced sensitivity for detecting subtle cardiac abnormalities, digital X-ray systems with lower radiation doses, and laboratory equipment capable of faster processing of critical tests all contributed to improved care for elderly patients. Dr. Wilson, the cardiologist who had treated Margaret, was particularly enthusiastic about the new cardiac monitoring equipment. "Mrs. Thompson, this equipment would have detected your heart attack immediately, even if the initial symptoms were subtle," he told her during a tour of the updated cardiac unit. "The early detection capabilities we now have will prevent other patients from experiencing the delayed diagnosis you suffered. 6 months into the implementation process, the results were already impressive. Patient satisfaction scores for elderly patients had increased by 40%. The average time for diagnosis of cardiac issues in elderly patients had been reduced by 3 days. The number of elderly patients requiring readmission within 30 days of discharge had dropped by 25%. Margaret reviewed these statistics with pride and satisfaction, but she remained focused on individual patient stories rather than abstract numbers. During one of her regular visits to the hospital, she encountered Mrs. Dorothy Miller, an 81-year-old woman who had recently been treated in the emergency department for chest pain. "Mrs. Thompson," Dorothy said, recognizing Margaret from news coverage, "I want to thank you for what you've done here. The doctor who treated me yesterday spent 20 minutes with me, ordered several tests, and explained everything carefully. He didn't once suggest that my symptoms were just due to my age." These individual encounters reminded Margaret why she had made the donation and reinforced her commitment to ensuring its continued effectiveness. As the first year of implementation progressed, Margaret realized that her donation had accomplished something beyond improving patient care. It had created a culture change within the hospital that valued and respected elderly patients in ways that would persist long after her involvement ended. The success of Margaret's donation program was not without its challenges. As the William Thompson Center for Geriatric Excellence neared completion and the various programs became fully operational, several unexpected issues emerged that tested Margaret's resolve and the hospital's commitment to the ambitious goals they had set. The first major challenge came from an unexpected source: resistance from some elderly patients themselves. A small but vocal group of seniors expressed concern that the specialized programs were segregating them from mainstream medical care, making them feel singled out because of their age. Mrs. Helen Carter, 74, voiced these concerns during a community meeting Margaret attended to gather feedback on the program's progress. "Mrs. Thompson, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want to be treated differently just because I'm old," Mrs. Carter said, her voice carrying a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. "When I go to the doctor, I want to be seen as a patient, not as an elderly patient who needs special handling." Margaret had not anticipated this perspective, and it troubled her deeply. She scheduled individual meetings with several elderly patients who had expressed similar concerns, wanting to understand their viewpoint fully. "Mrs. Carter, I hear what you're saying, and I want you to know that the goal was never to segregate elderly patients or treat them as a special category," Margaret explained during their private conversation. "The programs were designed to ensure that age-related medical issues are properly recognized and addressed, not to create separate or inferior care." Through these conversations, Margaret learned that some patients felt the specialized programs implied weakness or incapacity. Working with Dr. Walsh and the patient advocacy team, they modified their approach to emphasize enhanced care rather than specialized treatment, making the programs available but not mandatory for elderly patients. The second challenge was more systemic: budget pressures that threatened the sustainability of some programs. While Margaret's $8 million endowment provided substantial funding, the hospital's overall financial situation remained tight, and there was pressure to redirect resources from the elderly care programs to other pressing needs. During a tense board meeting in late fall, this tension came to a head when board member Patricia Anderson, no relation to the dismissed Dr. Anderson, suggested scaling back some of the training programs to allocate funds for pediatric care improvements. While Mrs. Thompson's generosity is remarkable, we have to consider the needs of all our patients, Patricia Anderson argued. The pediatric wing desperately needs equipment updates, and we're serving far more children than elderly patients. Margaret had been attending board meetings as an observer, but she asked to address this concern directly. "Ms. Anderson, "I understand the competing demands on hospital resources," Margaret began, her voice calm but firm. "However, the conditions of my donation were clear. These funds are specifically designated for elderly patient care, and they cannot be redirected to other purposes." She had come prepared with data showing the positive impact of the programs. "The improvements we've implemented have already reduced readmission rates for elderly patients by 25%, which saves the hospital money in the long term. The enhanced diagnostic capabilities have caught serious conditions earlier, preventing more expensive emergency interventions." Dr. Clark supported Margaret's position, pointing out that the elderly care improvements were actually generating positive financial returns for the hospital through improved efficiency and reduced liability issues. The third challenge was perhaps the most personal for Margaret: the discovery that her donation had created some resentment among staff members who felt that elderly patients were now receiving preferential treatment at the expense of other patient populations. This tension came to light during a difficult conversation with Dr. Sarah Johnson, the young resident who had initially been so grateful for Margaret's donation. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to be honest with you about something that's been troubling me," Dr. Johnson said during one of Margaret's regular hospital visits. "Some of the staff are starting to feel that we're being pressured to spend disproportionate time and resources on elderly patients, while other patients with equally serious conditions aren't receiving the same level of attention." Margaret was dismayed by this revelation. "Dr. Johnson, that was never the intention. The goal was to improve care for elderly patients up to the standard that other patients receive, not to create preferential treatment." This feedback prompted Margaret to work with hospital administration to clarify the program's goals and ensure that improvements in elderly care didn't come at the expense of other patients. Additional training sessions were held to address staff concerns and emphasize that good geriatric care practices often benefited patients of all ages. The fourth challenge emerged from the program's very success. Other hospitals and healthcare systems began recruiting the specialized staff that Margaret's funding had attracted to St. Mary's. Dr. Walsh received several attractive job offers from competing institutions, and 2 of the specially trained geriatric nurses left for higher-paying positions elsewhere. "Mrs. Thompson, we're facing a classic problem of success," Dr. Clark explained during one of their regular meetings. "We've created excellent programs and attracted outstanding staff, but now other institutions are trying to poach our people." Margaret realized that sustaining the program's quality would require ongoing investment beyond her original donation. She worked with the hospital's Human Resources Department to develop retention strategies, including performance bonuses and professional development opportunities funded through her endowment. Despite these challenges, the positive impacts of Margaret's donation continued to accumulate. The William Thompson Center for Geriatric Excellence officially opened in December, exactly 1 year after Margaret's initial announcement. The opening ceremony was attended by healthcare professionals from throughout the region, many interested in implementing similar programs at their own institutions. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had documented the center's early results, which exceeded even the optimistic projections made during the planning phase. Patient satisfaction scores for elderly patients had reached the highest levels in the hospital's history. The average length of stay for elderly patients had decreased by 2 days, while the quality of care had improved significantly. More importantly to Margaret, individual patient stories continued to demonstrate the program's impact. Mr. Frank Williams, 83, had been properly diagnosed with a heart condition that might have been missed under the previous system. Mrs. Betty Johnson had received comprehensive treatment for multiple conditions during a single hospital stay, coordinated through the center's integrated approach to geriatric care. During the center's opening ceremony, Margaret was asked to cut the ribbon and make remarks about the program's first year. As she stood before the assembled crowd, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment and gratitude. 1 year ago, I made a donation to this hospital, not out of generosity, but out of necessity, Margaret said. The changes we've implemented together have prevented other elderly patients from experiencing the dismissive care and delayed diagnosis that I suffered. She paused, looking at the faces in the crowd, doctors, nurses, administrators, and elderly patients who had benefited from the programs. But perhaps the most important change isn't in the equipment or the procedures, Margaret continued. It's in the culture of respect and attention that now characterizes how elderly patients are treated at St. Mary's. That cultural change will outlast any individual donation or program. As the ceremony concluded and Margaret toured the completed center, she reflected on the challenges they had overcome and those that still lay ahead. The path to improving elderly patient care had been more complex than she had initially anticipated, but the results justified the effort and resources invested. 2 years after Margaret's initial donation, the impact of her generosity had rippled far beyond the walls of St. Mary's General Hospital. The William Thompson Center for Geriatric Excellence had become a model for elderly patient care, attracting visitors from healthcare institutions across the country who wanted to learn from the innovative programs Margaret had funded. The recognition began with local awards, but soon expanded to national attention. In the spring, Margaret received notification that she had been selected to receive the American Hospital Association's Distinguished Service Award for her contributions to healthcare improvement. The award ceremony would be held in Chicago, with Margaret being recognized alongside other healthcare innovators and philanthropists. Margaret had mixed feelings about the attention. While she appreciated the recognition of her work, she remained uncomfortable with the focus on her personal story rather than the broader issues of elderly patient care. "Susan, I never wanted to become a public figure," Margaret confided to her friend as they reviewed the invitation to the award ceremony. "I just wanted to fix a problem that nearly cost me my life." Susan smiled at her friend's characteristic humility. "Margaret, whether you wanted it or not, you've become a symbol of what individuals can accomplish when they refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. That's important." Dr. Clark had been instrumental in nominating Margaret for the award, documenting the measurable improvements in patient care that had resulted from her donation and ongoing involvement. "Mrs. Thompson, the data speaks for itself," Dr. Clark had written in his nomination letter. "Since the implementation of programs funded by Mrs. Thompson's donation, our elderly patient mortality rates have decreased by 15%. Patient satisfaction scores have increased by 40%, and we've become a regional referral center for complex geriatric cases." But beyond the statistics, Dr. Clark had emphasized the cultural transformation Margaret had catalyzed within the hospital. The award ceremony in Chicago was an elegant affair, held in the ballroom of a downtown hotel with hundreds of healthcare professionals in attendance. Margaret had agreed to accept the award, but had initially declined the invitation to give an acceptance speech, feeling uncomfortable with public speaking on such a large stage. However, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who accompanied Margaret to Chicago, convinced her to reconsider. "Mrs. Thompson, you have a platform to speak about issues that affect millions of elderly Americans," Dr. Walsh said during their flight to Chicago. "Your story can inspire other people to advocate for better health care and other institutions to prioritize elderly patient care." Margaret spent the evening before the ceremony carefully preparing her remarks, wanting to strike the right balance between acknowledging the honor and focusing attention on ongoing challenges in elderly health care. When her name was called, Margaret walked to the podium with quiet dignity, wearing the same navy dress she had worn to announce her donation 2 years earlier. As she looked out at the audience of healthcare professionals, she felt a familiar surge of the determination that had driven her initial advocacy. 2.5 years ago, I was a patient experiencing chest pain and shortness of breath," Margaret began, her voice clear and steady. "I was dismissed by a physician who attributed my symptoms to normal aging without proper investigation. That dismissive treatment nearly cost me my life," she continued, describing the investigation she had conducted into similar cases of inadequate elderly patient care and the systemic issues she had discovered. "The donation I made to St. Mary's Hospital was not an act of generosity. It was an act of necessity. It was an investment in ensuring that other elderly patients would receive the respectful, thorough medical care that every person deserves, regardless of age." Margaret went on to describe the specific programs that had been implemented and their measurable impacts on patient care. But she also addressed the ongoing challenges that healthcare institutions faced in providing excellent geriatric care. "While we've made significant progress at one hospital, the problems that led to my initial experience persist throughout our healthcare system," Margaret said. "Age bias in medical care remains a serious issue that affects millions of elderly Americans every year." Her speech concluded with a challenge to the healthcare professionals in the audience. "Each of you has the power to ensure that elderly patients in your care receive the respect, attention, and thorough evaluation they deserve. You don't need an $8 million donation to listen carefully to patient concerns, to avoid assumptions about aging, and to provide comprehensive care to all patients, regardless of age." The standing ovation that followed Margaret's speech was lengthy and heartfelt. Several healthcare professionals approached her afterward to discuss implementing similar programs at their institutions. Dr. Robert Chen, a geriatrician from California, was among those who sought Margaret out after the ceremony. "Mrs. Thompson, your story and your advocacy have inspired us to examine our own practices and assumptions about elderly patient care," Dr. Chen said. "We're working to implement training programs similar to what you've funded at St. Mary's." These conversations continued throughout the weekend, with Margaret finding herself at the center of discussions about healthcare reform, patient advocacy, and the challenges facing elderly Americans in the medical system. When Margaret returned home, she found that the national recognition had generated renewed local interest in her story. The local newspaper ran a feature article about her award, and she received calls from several other philanthropists interested in healthcare donations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source: a letter from Dr. Richard Anderson, the physician who had initially dismissed her symptoms. Margaret opened the letter with some trepidation, unsure what to expect from the doctor whose negligence had started her journey. "Dear Mrs. Thompson," the letter began, "I have followed the news coverage of your donation to St. Mary's Hospital and your recent national recognition. I want to express my profound regret for the inadequate care I provided to you and my admiration for the positive changes you have created as a result of that experience." Dr. Anderson went on to explain that he had undergone extensive additional training in geriatric medicine since leaving St. Mary's and had taken a position at a rural hospital where he was applying the lessons he had learned. "While I cannot undo the harm I caused through my dismissive treatment, I want you to know that your advocacy has changed how I practice medicine. Every elderly patient I see now receives my full attention and careful evaluation, regardless of how routine their symptoms might appear." The letter concluded with Dr. Anderson's commitment to becoming an advocate for elderly patient care in his new position. Margaret was moved by the letter, seeing it as evidence that change was possible even in individuals who had initially been part of the problem. As the second anniversary of her donation approached, Margaret reflected on the unexpected journey that had transformed her from a dismissed patient into a nationally recognized healthcare advocate. The recognition was gratifying, but more important was the knowledge that her experience had led to meaningful improvements in patient care that would benefit elderly patients for generations to come. The William Thompson Center continued to serve as a model for other institutions and Margaret had been invited to serve on advisory boards for healthcare organizations seeking to improve their geriatric care programs. But perhaps the most satisfying recognition came in the form of individual patient stories, elderly people who had received excellent care at St. Mary's, whose symptoms had been taken seriously, whose concerns had been heard and addressed promptly. These stories reminded Margaret that behind all the awards, publicity, and recognition lay the simple but profound goal that had motivated her initial donation, ensuring that no elderly patient would ever again be dismissed the way she had been. 5 years after her life-changing encounter with Dr. Anderson, Margaret Thompson found herself back in the familiar surroundings of St. Mary's General Hospital. But this time, her visit was purely ceremonial. The hospital was celebrating the 5th anniversary of the William Thompson Center for Geriatric Excellence, and Margaret had been invited to speak at the commemorative event and tour the latest expansions to the program. At 83, Margaret moved more slowly than she had during her initial advocacy efforts, but her mind remained sharp and her commitment to elderly patient care as strong as ever. The years had brought their own health challenges. She now used a walker and required medication for diabetes, but she had received excellent care for each condition, much of it at the very hospital she had transformed. "Mrs. Thompson, it's wonderful to see you," Dr. Clark greeted her warmly as she entered the hospital's main lobby, which now featured a prominent display chronicling the history and impact of the William Thompson Center. "You look well." "I feel blessed, Dr. Clark, blessed to have lived long enough to see the changes we've made together and to know that they're making a real difference in people's lives." The display in the lobby told the story of the center's evolution from Margaret's initial donation to its current status as a nationally recognized model for geriatric care. Photographs showed the construction process, the training programs, the staff members who had been hired, and most importantly, testimonials from patients whose lives had been improved by the enhanced care. As Margaret toured the expanded center, she was struck by how far the program had grown beyond her original vision. What had begun as a response to one woman's dismissive treatment had evolved into a comprehensive system of elderly patient advocacy that now served as a template for healthcare institutions throughout the country. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, now the Director of Geriatric Medicine, accompanied Margaret on the tour, explaining the various programs that had been added over the years. "Mrs. Thompson, we now have geriatric specialists in every major medical department, not just cardiology and internal medicine," Dr. Walsh explained as they walked through the bright, welcoming corridors of the center. "Your original donation has leveraged additional funding that has allowed us to expand the program far beyond what we initially envisioned." They stopped at the Patient Advocacy Office, where Maria Rodriguez continued to coordinate support services for elderly patients. Maria had been promoted to Director of Patient Advocacy, overseeing a team of advocates who now assisted hundreds of elderly patients each year. "Mrs. Thompson," Maria said, embracing her warmly, "I want to show you something that I think will make you proud." Maria led Margaret to a wall covered with letters and photographs from patients who had been helped by the advocacy program. Hundreds of thank-you notes, wedding invitations from grateful families, and photos of patients who had recovered from serious illnesses created a powerful testament to the program's impact. One letter particularly caught Margaret's attention. It was from Mrs. Dorothy Miller, now 86, whom Margaret had met during the early days of the program's implementation. "Dear Mrs. Thompson and the wonderful staff at the William Thompson Center," the letter read, "5 years ago, you saved my life by ensuring that my chest pain was taken seriously rather than dismissed as normal aging. Today, I'm writing to tell you that I just celebrated my 60th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, who might not have had me in their lives if not for your advocacy. Thank you for giving me these precious years. Margaret felt tears well up in her eyes as she read the letter. These individual stories had always meant more to her than any award or recognition. The commemorative ceremony was held in the hospital's auditorium, which was filled with healthcare professionals, community leaders, and many of the elderly patients who had benefited from the center's services over the years. Margaret had been asked to deliver the keynote address, reflecting on the 5-year journey from her initial dismissive treatment to the current state of elderly patient care at St. Mary's. As she approached the podium, Margaret felt a familiar mixture of nervousness and determination. Public speaking had never become completely comfortable for her, but the importance of her message continued to give her strength. 5 years ago, I experienced every elderly person's nightmare, Margaret began, her voice steady despite the large audience. I was dismissed by a physician who saw my age before he saw my symptoms, who made assumptions about my health based on stereotypes rather than medical evidence. She paused, looking out at the audience, which included several elderly patients. She recognized from the center that dismissive treatment nearly cost me my life, but it also opened my eyes to a systemic problem that affects millions of elderly Americans every year. Today, I want to talk not just about what we've accomplished here at St. Mary's, but about what still needs to be done throughout our healthcare system. Margaret described the statistics that demonstrated the center's success: a 50% reduction in misdiagnosed conditions among elderly patients, a 40% decrease in preventable hospital readmissions, and patient satisfaction scores that consistently ranked among the highest in the region. But beyond the numbers, Margaret continued, what we've really accomplished is a transformation in how elderly patients are viewed and treated. We've proven that age is not a barrier to receiving excellent medical care, and that listening to elderly patients' concerns is not just compassionate, it's medically necessary. Margaret shared stories of patients whose lives had been saved by the attentive care they received at the center, conditions that might have been missed under the previous system, and families who had been spared the grief of preventable medical tragedies. The success of the William Thompson Center has inspired similar programs at hospitals throughout the country. What began as one woman's frustration with dismissive care has become a movement toward better health care for all elderly Americans. She acknowledged the challenges that remained, including ongoing age bias in medical care, financial pressures on health care systems, and the need for continued advocacy and education. But I'm optimistic about the future, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. I'm optimistic because I've seen what's possible when healthcare professionals, administrators, and patients work together to create meaningful change. I'm optimistic because I know that each of you in this audience has the power to make a difference in the lives of elderly patients. As Margaret concluded her remarks, the audience rose in a sustained standing ovation. Many people were visibly moved, and several elderly patients approached her afterward to share their own stories of excellent care they had received at the center. Following the ceremony, Margaret was invited to participate in a panel discussion with healthcare professionals from other institutions who had implemented similar programs based on the St. Mary's model. The discussion was moderated by Dr. Patricia Miller, who had been instrumental in Margaret's proper diagnosis 5 years earlier. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Miller asked, when you first came to my office 5 years ago, did you envision that your experience would lead to such widespread changes in elderly health care? Margaret smiled, remembering that pivotal appointment that had probably saved her life. Dr. Miller, at that time, I was focused simply on getting proper medical care for myself. I had no idea that my experience would resonate with so many other people or lead to the changes we've seen. She paused, reflecting on the journey. But I think that's often how meaningful change happens. It starts with one person refusing to accept unacceptable treatment and being willing to take action to prevent others from having the same experience. Dr. Walsh spoke about the practical aspects of implementing geriatric care improvements, emphasizing that Margaret's ongoing involvement had been crucial to the program's success. Having Mrs. Thompson actively engaged in oversight and planning has been invaluable, Dr. Walsh said. Her patient perspective, combined with her commitment to accountability, has kept us focused on what really matters, improving care for elderly patients rather than simply creating programs that look good on paper. The panel discussed the challenges other institutions had faced in implementing similar programs, including resistance from staff, budget constraints, and the difficulty of changing established practices and attitudes. Margaret addressed these challenges directly. Change is never easy, especially in healthcare where lives are at stake. But the cost of not changing, the cost of continuing to dismiss elderly patients' concerns and provide substandard care, is far greater than the investment required to improve. As the day's events concluded, Margaret took one final tour of the William Thompson Center, this time accompanied by Dr. Wilson, the cardiologist who had treated her heart attack 5 years earlier. Mrs. Thompson, I have to tell you, treating you back then was one of the most significant cases of my career, Dr. Wilson said, as they walked through the cardiac care unit, which now featured state-of-the-art equipment funded by Margaret's donation, not because of the medical complexity, but because of what grew out of that treatment. They stopped at the room where Margaret had recovered from her heart attack, now part of a unit specifically designed for elderly cardiac patients with specialized monitoring equipment and staff trained in geriatric cardiology. Dr. Wilson, I've often wondered what would have happened if Dr. Anderson had ordered the tests you eventually performed. Would I have had a different outcome? Would I have made the donation and created all these programs? Dr. Wilson considered the question carefully. I think your experience with dismissive care was probably necessary to motivate the advocacy that followed. If you had received proper care initially, you might never have understood the scope of the problem or felt compelled to take action. Margaret nodded, recognizing the truth in his observation. Perhaps everything happens for a reason. My initial poor treatment led to changes that have helped thousands of other patients receive better care. As evening approached, Margaret sat in the center's comfortable family lounge, looking out at the city where she had lived her entire life. The lounge was filled with elderly patients and their families, all receiving the kind of attentive, respectful care that should be standard but had required her $8 million donation to ensure. Susan Davis, now 70 and dealing with her own age-related health issues, joined Margaret for the ride home. How do you feel about everything you've accomplished? Susan asked as they drove through the familiar neighborhoods of their city. Margaret considered the question, thinking about the journey from that first dismissive encounter with Dr. Anderson to the thriving center that now bore her husband's name. I feel grateful, she said finally. Grateful that I survived that heart attack. Grateful that I had the resources to make a difference. And grateful that so many people were willing to work together to create meaningful change. She paused, watching the sunset paint the sky. Brilliant colors. But mostly, I feel hopeful. Hopeful that the changes we've made will outlast my involvement and continue to benefit elderly patients for generations to come. As they pulled into Margaret's driveway, she reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. The modest widow, who had been dismissed and nearly died 5 years earlier, had become a catalyst for nationwide improvements in elderly health care. Her story had been featured in medical journals, healthcare policy discussions, and inspirationals, articles about the power of individual advocacy. But for Margaret, the most meaningful outcome was simpler and more personal. The knowledge that elderly patients at St. Mary's Hospital and increasingly at hospitals throughout the country would be listened to, taken seriously, and provided with the excellent medical care that every person deserves, regardless of age. The William Thompson Center for Geriatric Excellence stood as a permanent testament to what could be accomplished when dismissive treatment was met with determined advocacy, when individual frustration was channeled into systemic change, and when one person's refusal to accept substandard care became the foundation for transforming healthcare delivery for millions of elderly Americans. As Margaret settled into her favorite chair that evening, surrounded by letters from grateful patients and awards recognizing her contributions to healthcare, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment and peace. Her husband, William, would have been proud of the legacy created in his name, and she knew that the impact of her advocacy would continue long after she was gone, ensuring that future generations of elderly patients would receive the respectful, comprehensive medical care that had nearly been denied to her. The story that had begun with dismissal and frustration had ended with transformation and hope, a fitting conclusion to a journey that had proven the power of individual advocacy to create meaningful, lasting change in the world.